Have you ever heard the phrase years of lead? The phrase years of lead describes a phase of extreme political conflict within the Italian First Republic from 1968 to 1982. During the late 1960s, from 1968 to 1970, Italy was a hotbed of political unrest, plagued by strikes and riots organized by Marxist student groups, culminating in 1970 with the creation of the Red Brigades, a Marxist-Leninist terrorist organization that sought out to overthrow the Italian Republic and the Sovietization of Italy. This group started out with small acts of vandalism, such as setting fire to the parked car of the head of Siemens in Milan, but then escalated into far more vicious and violent attacks that became more and more daring and brutal as the years went by. The assassination of police officers and eventually even the police chief of Rome, bombings of political events, assassinations of right-wing politicians, assassinations of judges, lawyers and other state officials, assassinations of journalists, assassinations of CEOs of big Italian companies, assassinations of university professors and school teachers, assassinations of army members, assassinations of trade union members, and the assassination of an American diplomat. The culmination of Red Brigade violence took place in the years from 1978 to 1980, when most assassinations and kidnappings took place, and when the Red Brigades in 1978 kidnapped the Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro after murdering his 5 bodyguards. After what the Red Brigades farcically called a trial by the people, the Prime Minister was murdered and his body dumped in a trash dumpster. Communist terrorism was widespread in Europe throughout the 1970s and 1980s in Germany, France and Italy, but nowhere as brutal and had so many victims as in Italy. However, and this might surprise many of you, most victims of terrorism in Italy were not killed by left-wing terrorist attacks, not even by Islamic terrorist attacks, but by right-wing fascist terrorist attacks. Italy after the Second World War didn't go through such an extensive phase of denazification as Germany and other former Axis nations did. As a result, from 1946 onward, Italy had a fascist party, the Italian Social Movement, within its political sphere, which was, however, on a constant decline until the 1970s. During the early years of the Years of Lead, left-wing radicals from student movements would assault and later even murder right-wing and fascist student activists. A few months later, left-wing terrorists would brutalize, murder, and even bomb members of that political party at party meetings and homes. In one particularly gruesome incident, they firebombed the home of a member of the Italian Fascist Party. The attack did not succeed in killing him, but his 2 sons, aged 8 and 20. It was through the attacks on the Italian state that the Italian Fascist Party and movement regained some popularity, and through events such as the murders of its members that this movement even gained some public sympathy. And through that rise in popularity, combined with the constant threat against the state by the Red Brigades, out of the people flocking into the new neo-fascist Italian movement, formed the Movement for the New Political Order, a fascist terror organization which in its early years tried to portray itself as the enforcer of law and order in the absence of state authority to enforce the law against far-left thugs. However, the image they sought to create of themselves was quickly destroyed when they planted a bomb killing 3 police officers in an attempt to push the Italian government into declaring a state of emergency by blaming the bombing on the Red Brigades. The New Order movement messed things up for their image further by planting bombs at an anti-fascist demonstration in Brescia that killed 8 and wounded over 100 people. They also bombed an Italian express train from Rome to Munich that killed 12 and injured over 100 people. These initial bombing attacks by the far right were less common than the Red Brigade's assassination campaigns, but managed to cost the lives of so many within such a short period of time that the number of victims started to rise and overtake the number of victims by communist terror. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, when Red Brigade violence was at its peak, sympathizers and members of this fascist terror group even attempted a coup in order to overthrow the Italian Republic and establish a neo-fascist state. The culmination of the fascist terror campaign in Italy, however, came in 1980, when the Italian fascists Francesca Mambro and Giuseppe Fioravanti planted a bomb at the Bologna Central train station that killed 85 people and wounded over 200. To this day, the 4th deadliest terrorist attack in Europe. Instead of destabilizing the Italian Republic even further, the result of this attack was a public turning away in utter disgust. The state and its executive would eventually gain the upper hand and restore order, bringing an end to 14 years of left-wing and right-wing violence in the late 1980s. The term Years of of lead, however, has entered our language as a phrase describing a tactic or set of events that can undo the checks and balances which safeguard the democratic process and civil liberties. It was conflict between far-right and far-left armed militias which brought down the Weimar Republic in Germany and replaced it with the Nazi regime. It was conflict between the armed socialists and armed nationalist militias which brought down the Austrian Republic and replaced it with the Austro-fascist regime. It was conflict between Mussolini's black shirts and communist militias which eventually brought down Italy's constitutional monarchy and replaced it with a fascist regime. Authoritarian movements can't succeed within the democratic forum and flourish within social chaos and conflict perpetuated by opposing authoritarian forces. In both cases, the democratic egalitarian structure is ideologically reduced to nothing more than an enabler to the opposition that must also be ended. Fascists portrayed themselves as the bringers of order into chaos that was caused by the supposed failures of democracy to bring the authoritarian left at heel. Communists portrayed themselves as the self-righteous fighters against fascism that supposedly was brought into existence by democracy's weakness to confront fascism, whilst in fact the only thing that produces fascism is fascists, the only thing that produces communism is communists, and they thrive on each other's tendency to justify their own existence, whilst making democracy, egalitarianism and pluralism the supposed enabler of all evil. The structures that safeguard our liberties through constitution and the democratic framework have inherent in them a fundamental structure of rules that demand that no political movement use violence to enforce its will over others, and that the only arbiter of violence should be the state's judiciary and executive, who must under all circumstances be independent from the political powers in charge of the state. It is when that first rule is broken, when radical movements disregard the public forum of debate in favor of violence, that it is of the utmost importance to condemn and clamp down upon whatever side engages in this transgression. For if that is not done, the independent judiciary might also fall prey to political whims. The reason I bring this up is because I fear that we might be entering a similar stage in some Western societies again. In Quebec, a 27-year-old white nationalist walked into a mosque and murdered 6 people in a right-wing terrorist attack. Only a week prior to this attack, a nationwide police operation in Germany seized weapons and explosives stashed belonging to right-wing extremists who apparently planned attacks in Germany. The attack in Quebec only briefly seemed to gain wider media attention, and even less in our YouTube circles. I have often warned of making foregone conclusions over terrorist attacks when these are still happening, and this seems to be the extent to which reporting on this attack was limited. Brief announcements over Islamic terror, and after the realization that it wasn't Islamic, silence. Now, I have made several videos in which I point out that Islamic terrorism is by far the greater threat to our society. However, this is no excuse to ignore the current build-up of radical tensions within Western societies, which could be just as successful in undermining our liberties. There were 4 terrorist attacks throughout the past few years, which specifically got my attention. The Charleston church attack in the US, the Dallas attack in the US, the Normandy church attack in France, and the Nice attack in France. As an overview, terrorism throughout the years from the 1970s to today has always involved a lot of planning and work. From the IRA to the Red Brigades to fascist movements to Islamist movements, terrorists always started out by going into hiding and removing themselves from the public eye, going into training camps in Yemen and elsewhere, training in terror tactics, spending months planning their attacks and becoming trained experts in terrorist tactics. Compare this to the recent attacks I gave as examples. The Charleston church attack was carried out by an individual who within a short period of time ideologically radicalized himself, received no such thing as combat training, and whose preparation consisted merely of buying a gun and carrying out the attack. The Dallas attacker may have received military training in the US Army and had experience during the Afghan War. However, he did not need to go into hiding or get into contact with a wider terrorist network structure to buy a gun and carry out his attack. The Normandy church attacker who slowly sawed off the head of a Catholic priest with a blunt knife was a 12-year-old boy incapable of receiving terror training, let alone training of a firearm, which he didn't even need since a knife and his beliefs were enough for the attack. And the Nice attacker was a drug-dealing thug before only needing to rent a truck to butcher dozens of people in the name of Allah. There are some differences within these attacks that are not just ideological. Terror statistics will show you that both right-wing and Islamic terrorists tend to target civilians, whilst left-wing terrorists tend to attack state state officials and police. Unlike the Islamic jihadists, left-wing and right-wing terrorists so far do not have a wider logistical, organizational and ideological connecting framework of command and supply available to them in order to organize attacks and support, as well as wider public support from the Islamic world and authority figures, which is, in my opinion, why Islamic terror is so predominant in our day and age. Islamic fascism is a foreign and invasive threat, not only to the West but to civilization itself, whilst left-wing and right-wing terror are more domestic in nature. The one thing, however, that they do have in common is the lack of training and planning and the lack of an underground support network. Committing a massacre with the intention of destabilizing society no longer requires the steps into the underground and out of public sight that it did 20 years ago. Terror can now be committed by the common person. Other than that, there is also the drastic change in our social climate that bothers me greatly and points towards an increased undermining of our liberties by the domestic radical forces of both political extremes. There was the punching of Richard Spencer, which resulted in him talking about the increasing need for security. The alt-right movement itself frequently speaks of the failure of humanism, and you will often find the term "Thy America" within posts and profiles as they gleefully hope for a collapse of civil society and democracy and for a war of race and ideology that would free them of the shackles of the rules of engagement implicit in the public speaking forum. A movement that speaks of right-wing death squads and latches on to a prophecy of a race war can't thrive within a free society and reveals its intentions of undermining such for wishing upon us the circumstances that have undermined freedom before, all the while blaming the democratic structures that ensure freedom for the ills of modern society. The left-wing social justice side of things are not any better at all. In the aftermath of the sucker punch against Richard Spencer, we have witnessed not an outcry against violence but apologia for violence, and even obsessive and blatantly freakish hopes for violence to finally unfold itself upon wider society, whilst blaming the democratic structures and rules that secure our society for the ills that befall our society. Both sides apparently wish nothing more than a collapse of the democratic framework, the collapse of humanism and the arrival of a destabilized society and wasteland where reason is dismissed in favor of barbarism and violence to decide who and what ideologies may rule. The survival of the most violent is apparently to them the way to decide the question over who and what should rule, rather than the survival of the better argument through election and debate. We see the advocacy of this behavior beyond our own smaller sphere of debate on YouTube, reflected within attitudes advocated by the media. The Guardian uploaded a video recently that essentially justifies, if not indirectly advocates, violence against those that it deems to be politically incorrect and opposed to its views of what the world should be. And as this video is in production, members of the Martin Luther King Society, a figure who achieved his movement's goals not through destabilizing society with violence, but through a course of respecting the rights of those they opposed in a struggle where they wanted to achieve those very same rights, stormed the grounds of UC Berkeley, clad in black, to start a violent, disruptive riot for the purpose of preventing something as innocuous as a loudmouth provocateur from speaking. We went from deplatforming, shadow banning and banning to outright justifications for violence, with complete and utter disregard for the notions of civil discourse and reason upon which our civilization has been built and subsequently prospered. Some of you may think that the foreign threat coming from the Islamic world is far more pertinent for us to concern ourselves with than the enemies of civilization and the open society that come from within our societies. But I would argue that if we ignore both these violent elements, their actions, their attacks and their gibberish for too long, we might find ourselves sorry for having done so. Discourse and discussion to persuade others of one's political views whilst rejecting violence is one of the principles that safeguard our civilization from falling into barbarism and tyranny. The open forum to discuss ideas is a cornerstone of our civilization, and having it disregarded in favor of violence is the overstepping of a Rubicon that we cannot allow to happen if our way of life is to be continued. If the level-headed basic civility of having discourse rather than engaging in violence for political means is lost, we will lose everything that we hold dear. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing or becoming a patron. But more importantly, consider registering an account on minds.com, an alternative social media platform that rivals Facebook in that it has a dedication to free speech. As a little incentive for you, all videos that are published on my channel will be published on my minds.com profile 24 hours in advance of them being published on YouTube.